A chilling encounter. Dr. William Will Hawkins strode through the hospital corridors, exuding confidence and command. The polished leather of his shoes clicked sharply against the floor, a sound that seemed to announce his arrival before he even entered a room. His pristine white lab coat hung perfectly over his tailored suit, and a faint aroma of cologne followed him. A deliberate choice to maintain an aura of professionalism and superiority. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a legend in the medical field. Patients traveled from distant cities to seek his expertise, and his colleagues spoke of his unmatched skill in awe-filled tones. Yet behind the accolades and reverence lay a man ruled by arrogance and deeply ingrained biases. It was a cloudy morning when Lydia Carter entered the hospital's emergency room. In her early 30s, Lydia carried herself with quiet strength, though the pain in her abdomen had reduced her to a fragile figure. She wore a simple dress that was slightly wrinkled, evidence of a sleepless night filled with worry. Her dark, soulful eyes reflected both pain and an unshakable resolve to fight whatever was wrong with her. Lydia had tried to ignore the symptoms for weeks, convincing herself it was probably something minor. But when the sharp pain in her abdomen became unbearable, she knew it was time to seek help. She sat in the waiting room clutching her side, her husband Marcus at her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. When Lydia's turn finally came, the nurse led her to an exam room and assured her that Dr. Hawkins would see her shortly. Marcus kissed her forehead and said, "I'll be right here when you're done." Moments later, Dr. Hawkins entered the room, his face impassive as he scanned her chart. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his sharp blue eyes gave her a cursory once-over. His lips tightened ever so slightly. "Lydia Carter?" he asked. His tone clipped. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice polite but strained. Dr. Hawkins nodded and flipped through her file. "It says here you've been experiencing abdominal pain. How long has this been going on?" "About 3 weeks," Lydia replied, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. "At first it was just a dull ache, but now it's sharp, and my stomach feels swollen. I've been feeling nauseous, too." Dr. Hawkins sighed softly, a sound almost imperceptible, but enough to make Lydia feel small. "Have you considered that this might be something as simple as overeating or stress-induced indigestion?" Lydia blinked, momentarily stunned by his dismissive tone. "I don't think it's just that, doctor. It's been getting worse, and Mrs. Carter," he interrupted, setting the chart down on the counter. "The human body often reacts to stress in ways that can mimic more serious conditions. Bloating, discomfort, even nausea. These are common symptoms that typically don't warrant panic. But this feels different," Lydia insisted, her voice trembling. "I know my body, and something isn't right." Dr. Hawkins finally turned to face her fully, his expression betraying a flicker of irritation. "Are you a medical professional, Mrs. Carter?" "No, but then I suggest you trust my expertise. I'll order some antacids and a mild pain reliever. If it doesn't improve in a week, follow up with your primary care physician." He picked up her chart and made a few notes, signaling that the conversation was over. Lydia felt a lump form in her throat. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. She had heard stories about doctors who dismissed patients like her, but experiencing it firsthand was something she hadn't prepared for. As Dr. Hawkins turned to leave, she mustered the courage to say, "Doctor, please, I don't want to waste your time, but I feel like something is really wrong. Can't we run a test or—" He paused at the door, turning slightly. "Mrs. Carter, I assure you there's nothing life-threatening here. Sometimes we have to let the body heal itself. Take the medication and rest. Good day." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Lydia in stunned silence. Outside the exam room, Dr. Hawkins handed the chart to a nurse without a second glance. "She's overreacting," he muttered under his breath as he walked away. The nurse hesitated, looking at Lydia's file. "Doctor, are you sure we shouldn't at least?" "Trust me, nurse," he said, cutting her off. "I've seen this 1,000 times. She'll be fine. As he disappeared down the hallway, the nurse glanced back at the exam room, where Lydia was still sitting, her head bowed and hands clasped tightly. Something didn't sit right with her, but she knew better than to question Dr. Hawkins openly. His reputation for being dismissive of input, especially from nurses, was well known. Inside the room, Lydia slowly slid off the exam table, her movements careful as the pain in her abdomen flared again. Marcus was waiting for her in the hallway, and as soon as he saw her face, he knew something wasn't right. "What did he say?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Lydia shook her head. "He said it's probably nothing. Stress or indigestion. He told me to take some antacids and rest." Marcus frowned. "That's it? He didn't run any tests?" She shook her head again, tears welling in her eyes. "He didn't believe me, Marcus. I could see it in his eyes. He doesn't think I'm worth his time." Marcus pulled her into a gentle hug, his jaw tightening as anger bubbled beneath the surface. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "If he won't help, we'll find someone who will." But neither of them knew just how urgent Lydia's condition was, or how her life would soon hang in the balance. The crisis unfolds. It had been 2 days since Lydia's visit to the hospital. She had followed Dr. Hawkins' instructions, diligently taking the prescribed antacids, but the sharp pain in her abdomen hadn't subsided. Instead, it had grown worse. Lydia could hardly keep food down, and the swelling in her abdomen had become so pronounced that even the slightest movement felt unbearable. Marcus, ever watchful, noticed the change in her condition. He had stayed up all night, sitting by her bedside, watching as Lydia struggled to find relief. Her groans of pain filled the silence of their small apartment, piercing through his heart like daggers. "Lydia, this isn't right," Marcus said the next morning, kneeling beside her as she lay on the couch, clutching her side. "We need to go back to the hospital. Something's not right." Lydia shook her head weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't afford another visit, Marcus. The doctor said it wasn't serious. What if they just send me home again?" Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes searching hers. "I don't care what that doctor said. I know you, Lydia. And I know when something's wrong. I won't sit here and let this get worse." Before Lydia could protest further, she felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over her. She bolted upright, clutching her abdomen as a sharp, stabbing pain coursed through her body. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt as though she might pass out. Marcus didn't wait another second. He scooped her into his arms, ignoring her feeble protests, and carried her to the car. The drive to the hospital felt agonizingly long, every bump in the road eliciting a wince from Lydia. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with worry and frustration. When they arrived at the emergency room, Marcus didn't waste time waiting in line. He rushed to the front desk, his voice firm but desperate. "My wife needs help. Now. She's in terrible pain, and it's getting worse." The triage nurse quickly assessed Lydia's condition and noted her pale complexion and rapid breathing. She nodded to Marcus and called for a stretcher. Lydia was whisked away to an exam room, and Marcus was left standing in the waiting area, his heart pounding. Inside the exam room, the medical staff worked quickly to stabilize Lydia. Her blood pressure was alarmingly low, and her pulse was weak. The attending physician, Dr. Patel, reviewed her symptoms and ordered a series of tests, including blood work and an ultrasound. As the minutes stretched into hours, Marcus paced the waiting room, his mind replaying their last encounter with Dr. Hawkins. He couldn't shake the image of Lydia sitting on that exam table, trying to convince a doctor who had already decided she wasn't worth his time. Finally, a nurse approached him, her expression grim. "Mr. Carter, your wife's condition is critical. She's experiencing internal bleeding, and we suspect it may be due to a ruptured ovarian cyst. Dr. Patel is requesting an emergency surgical consultation." Marcus felt his knees go weak. "Internal bleeding," he repeated, his voice shaking. "How did this happen?" She was just here 2 days ago, and they said it was nothing serious. The nurse hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I wasn't on duty then, Mr. Carter. But I assure you, we're doing everything we can for your wife now. Marcus clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Doing everything now doesn't erase what happened before. She could have died because someone didn't listen to her. Meanwhile, Dr. Hawkins was paged to the surgical wing. He had just finished a routine consultation and was looking forward to an afternoon of paperwork and catching up on research. When he saw Lydia's name on the chart, his jaw tightened. "She's back," he muttered, flipping through her file. The notes from Dr. Patel were clear. Suspected internal bleeding, possibly life-threatening. Hawkins' brow furrowed as he scanned the test results. The ultrasound images confirmed a ruptured cyst that had caused significant internal bleeding. Her hemoglobin levels were dangerously low, and her vitals were deteriorating rapidly. For the first time in years, Hawkins felt a pang of unease. He scrubbed in for surgery, his mind racing. As much as he tried to push it aside, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this situation could have been avoided if he had taken Lydia's concerns seriously during her first visit. Inside the operating room, the team worked in synchronized precision. Hawkins' hands moved with their usual skill, but his mind wasn't entirely focused on the procedure. He found himself glancing at Lydia's pale face and wondering how he had misjudged her so completely. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. Hawkins removed the ruptured cyst, repaired the damage, and ensured the bleeding was under control. By the time he finished, Lydia was stable, but her recovery would require careful monitoring. As he stepped out of the operating room, Hawkins was met by Marcus, who was waiting anxiously in the hallway. "Is she okay?" Marcus demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "She's stable," Hawkins replied, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. "The surgery was successful, but she'll need time to recover. We caught it just in time." Marcus' relief was palpable, but it was quickly overshadowed by his anger. "You caught it just in time," he said, his voice rising. "You had the chance to catch it 2 days ago, but you brushed her off like she didn't matter. Do you have any idea what that's like? To watch someone you love suffer because a doctor didn't care enough to listen." Hawkins opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. He had faced angry family members before, but this time was different. Marcus wasn't just angry, he was right. I'm sorry," Hawkins said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry doesn't cut it," Marcus snapped. "You're supposed to save lives, not gamble with them, because you think someone isn't worth your time." Hawkins nodded, the weight of Marcus' words settling heavily on his shoulders. "You're right," he admitted. "I failed her, and I failed you. But I promise, I'll do everything in my power to make it right." Marcus stared at him for a long moment before nodding curtly. "You'd better, because if something like this happens again, you'll have more than just me to answer to." As Marcus walked away, Hawkins stood alone in the hallway, his mind racing. For the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of his mistakes, and he knew that this moment would change him forever. A reckoning of conscience. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor flickered softly as Dr. Hawkins walked away from the surgical wing. He moved mechanically, his crisp white coat swaying slightly with each step, but inside, his mind was anything but calm. Lydia Carter's condition had unraveled something deep within him, something he hadn't faced in years: guilt. He returned to his office, closing the door behind him. The usually immaculate space felt suffocating. The polished mahogany desk, the numerous plaques showcasing his achievements, and the framed newspaper articles hailing him as one of the finest surgeons of his generation, all seemed to mock him. Hawkins dropped into his chair, running a hand over his face. For years, he had taken pride in his precision, his discipline, and his ability to remain emotionally detached. To him, patients were puzzles to solve, cases to conquer, not people with fears and stories. He had built his career on this cold efficiency, and it had rewarded him handsomely. But now, for the first time, he wondered how many patients like Lydia he had dismissed over the years. How many people had suffered because he hadn't looked beyond the surface. Hawkins opened Lydia's chart again, reviewing the details with new eyes. The symptoms she had described during her first visit were glaringly obvious now. Abdominal pain, swelling, and nausea. The signs of a ruptured ovarian cyst had been there all along, but he had been too blinded by his own biases to see it. It wasn't just a professional failure, it was a moral one. Meanwhile, in Lydia's hospital room, Marcus sat by her bedside, his hand gently cradling hers. Lydia was awake but groggy, her face pale and drawn. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence between them, a steady reminder of how close she had come to the edge. "You scared me," Marcus said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I scared myself," Lydia whispered, her voice weak but steady. "I knew something was wrong, Marcus. I tried to tell him, but he didn't listen." Marcus' jaw tightened. "He's going to listen now. You almost died, Lydia. If I hadn't pushed to bring you back, I don't even want to think about it." Lydia managed a faint smile, her strength flickering through the haze of exhaustion. "You always believe in me, even when no one else does." "Always," Marcus said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. As the hours passed, nurses came and went, checking Lydia's vitals and adjusting her IV drip. Dr. Patel, the attending physician who had initially taken over Lydia's care, stopped by to give Marcus an update. "She's doing well," Dr. Patel said, offering a reassuring smile. "Her vitals are stabilizing, and the surgery was successful. With rest and care, she'll make a full recovery." "Thank you, Doctor," Marcus said, his gratitude genuine. Dr. Patel hesitated before continuing. "I've spoken to Dr. Hawkins," she said carefully. "He wanted me to let you know that he plans to come by and speak with you both. I believe he has something he'd like to say." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "He'd better." Later that evening, Hawkins stood outside Lydia's room, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since his early days as a medical intern. Apologizing wasn't something he did often, and certainly not to patients. He had spent years building walls around himself, ensuring he never appeared vulnerable or unsure. But as he stared at the door in front of him, he realized those walls had trapped him in a prison of his own making. Summoning his courage, Hawkins knocked softly and stepped inside. Marcus was the first to notice him, his expression immediately hardening. Lydia turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Hawkins. "Dr. Hawkins," Marcus said, his tone cold. "What brings you here?" Hawkins took a deep breath, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something raw and unpolished. "I came to apologize," he said simply. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Apologize? That's a first." "I deserve that," Hawkins admitted, glancing briefly at Lydia before focusing on Marcus. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I failed you. When you came to me, I dismissed your concerns without giving you the attention and care you deserved. I made assumptions, and those assumptions nearly cost you your life." Lydia's expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. "Why didn't you listen to me?" she asked, her voice filled with both hurt and curiosity. Hawkins hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I've spent years focusing on the science of medicine, on perfecting my skills as a surgeon. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing my patients as people. I became arrogant. And in your case, I let my biases cloud my judgment. That's no excuse, but it's the truth." Marcus folded his arms, his protective instincts still on high alert. "And what happens next? You think an apology fixes this?" "No, it doesn't," Hawkins said firmly. "An apology isn't enough. But I can promise you this. I'm going to do better. Not just for you, but for every patient who walks through these doors. I'm reevaluating my practices, and I'll be working with my team to ensure that no one else is ever dismissed the way you were." There was a long silence as Marcus and Lydia exchanged a glance. Finally, Lydia spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you just yet, Doctor. But I do believe you mean what you're saying. I do, Hawkins said, his voice resolute. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove it. Over the following weeks, Hawkins made good on his promise. He enrolled in sensitivity training programs, attended seminars on unconscious bias, and began mentoring young doctors on the importance of listening to patients. He implemented a new protocol in his department, ensuring that every patient's concerns were taken seriously, regardless of their background or appearance. Word of Hawkins' transformation spread quickly. Nurses, who had once feared his dismissive attitude, began to see him in a new light. Patients who had once avoided him now sought his care, impressed by his newfound empathy and humility. For Lydia, recovery was slow but steady. She and Marcus continued to advocate for better patient care, sharing their story with local community groups and encouraging others to speak up when they felt unheard. And though it took time, Lydia eventually forgave Hawkins, not because she forgot what had happened, but because she saw the effort he was making to change. One day, months later, Hawkins received a letter in the mail. It was from Lydia. Inside was a simple note. "Thank you for listening. Keep doing better. Lydia Carter." Hawkins held the letter in his hands, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, he felt like a real healer, not just of bodies, but of trust and humanity. The ripple effect of change. Several months had passed since the night Lydia Carter's life had been saved. The hospital had returned to its usual rhythm, but for Dr. Hawkins, nothing felt the same. The once overconfident surgeon who strode through the halls as if he owned them was now a man transformed, not in skill, but in spirit. Every morning, Hawkins would start his day with rounds, personally visiting patients rather than sending a junior doctor in his place. He made it a point to ask questions, to listen, and most importantly, to truly see the people under his care. It was a shift that didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues or the hospital staff. "I don't know what's gotten into him," whispered a young nurse to her colleague as Hawkins left an exam room. "He's actually kind now." "I know," the other nurse replied, shaking her head in disbelief. "It's weird. He used to bark orders and barely look at patients, but now he's even asking about their families. I didn't think he had it in him." What they didn't know was that Hawkins had begun a private project. Every night, after finishing his hospital duties, he would retreat to his office and review patient feedback forms. These forms, often ignored by busy physicians, became his guiding light. He read every comment, every complaint, and every thank you note with meticulous care. One evening, as he sat at his desk, Hawkins came across a particularly moving letter. "Dear Dr. Hawkins, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to sit with me during my mother's surgery. I was terrified, but your reassurance meant the world to me. It reminded me that doctors aren't just healers of the body. They're healers of the heart, too. Please don't stop doing what you're doing. Sincerely, Abigail Law." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, the words sinking in. It wasn't the accolades or the titles that defined him. It was moments like these. Across town, Lydia was slowly returning to her normal life. Her recovery had been challenging, but with Marcus by her side, she found strength she hadn't known she possessed. One morning, as she sat on the couch sipping tea, Marcus handed her a flyer. "What's this?" Lydia asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's a community health fair," Marcus replied, sitting beside her. "They're offering free checkups, nutrition advice, and workshops on advocating for yourself in medical settings. I thought we could go." Lydia scanned the flyer, her interest piqued. "Advocating for yourself in medical settings," she repeated. "That sounds important." "It is," Marcus said firmly. "What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone else. If sharing our story can help even one person, then it's worth it." Lydia nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." The health fair was bustling with activity. Booths lined the community center, each manned by healthcare professionals, eager to share their knowledge. Lydia and Marcus made their way through the crowd, stopping to listen to lectures and chat with attendees. When they reached the stage area, Lydia took a deep breath. She had been invited to speak about her experience, a decision she had agonized over for weeks. Now, as she stood in front of the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of both fear and determination. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "My name is Lydia Carter, and I'm here to share a story. It's not an easy story to tell, but I believe it's one that needs to be heard." She recounted her experience at the hospital, the dismissal, the pain, the near-death experience, and the eventual surgery that saved her life. She spoke about the importance of trusting your instincts, advocating for yourself, and not letting anyone dismiss your concerns. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. People approached her afterward, sharing their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed by the healthcare system. Lydia realized that she wasn't alone, and neither were they. Back at the hospital, Dr. Hawkins' transformation was being put to the test. One afternoon, he was called to the emergency room to consult on a case involving an elderly man with severe chest pain. The man, Mr. Harold Thompson, was a retired schoolteacher who lived alone. As Hawkins reviewed his chart, he noticed something unusual. Mr. Thompson had been to the ER 3 times in the past month, each time with similar symptoms. Yet no definitive diagnosis had been made. "Mr. Thompson," Hawkins said gently, sitting beside the man's bed, "can you tell me more about what you've been feeling?" Harold's eyes filled with tears. "It's like an elephant sitting on my chest," he said, "but every time I come here, they send me home with painkillers and tell me it's stress. I don't know what to do anymore." Hawkins felt a pang of recognition. This was Lydia all over again, a patient crying out for help, only to be ignored. "We're going to figure this out," Hawkins promised, placing a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder. Over the next few hours, Hawkins ordered a series of tests, determined to leave no stone unturned. The results revealed a condition that had been missed during Harold's previous visits, a rare form of angina that required immediate intervention. As Harold was prepped for surgery, he gripped Hawkins' hand. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd just fade away." "Not on my watch," Hawkins replied with a small smile. Word of Hawkins' dedication continued to spread. Patients began requesting him by name, not because of his reputation as a skilled surgeon, but because of his newfound reputation as a compassionate one. Even the hospital administration took notice. During a staff meeting, the chief medical officer addressed the changes. "We've seen a remarkable improvement in patient satisfaction scores," she said. "Dr. Hawkins, your efforts haven't gone unnoticed. You've set a new standard for what it means to provide holistic care." Hawkins nodded humbly, the praise bittersweet. He knew his transformation had come at a cost, one he would carry with him forever. One evening, as Hawkins prepared to leave the hospital, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Lydia. "I heard about Mr. Thompson," she said, smiling warmly. "You saved him." Hawkins shrugged modestly. "I just did my job." "No," Lydia said firmly. "You did more than that. You listened. That's what makes the difference." Hawkins looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Lydia," he said softly, "for giving me a chance to change." "You earned it," she replied, "and I'm glad you did." As Lydia left, Hawkins stood in the quiet corridor, a man no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by the lessons he had learned from them. A legacy rewritten. The months that followed brought significant changes, not just for Dr. Hawkins, but for the entire hospital community. His efforts to create a more compassionate and patient-centered environment were gaining traction, and the hospital's administration began implementing policies aimed at ensuring that every patient's voice was heard. Hawkins' transformation had become a story that many of his colleagues now used as an example, but for him, it wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about repairing the damage he had done and making sure it never happened again. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, Hawkins glanced out the window, watching the city lights twinkle beneath the night sky. The world felt bigger somehow, more connected. His journey had opened his eyes to the vastness of human experience, the complexity of every life that passed through his care. But even as he made strides in his work, Hawkins was still haunted by one thing: his past. He couldn't help but think of all the patients he had failed before Lydia, the ones whose cries for help went unanswered. That night, his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. He opened it, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name at the top of the message. "Dr. Hawkins, I wanted to thank you once again for saving my life. I'm doing well, and my family is so grateful for everything you've done. I know you may never fully forgive yourself for what happened, but I hope you know that what you did for me, and for so many others, has made a difference. Thank you, Lydia Carter." Hawkins sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. It had been months since Lydia's surgery, but her forgiveness had allowed him to start forgiving himself. Lydia's journey had not only saved her own life, but had ultimately led to the salvation of countless others. And in the quiet corners of his mind, Hawkins realized that he had become a part of something bigger than himself, a ripple that spread outward, affecting lives in ways he had never imagined. Meanwhile, Lydia's life had also undergone a transformation. Since her recovery, she had become a vocal advocate for patient rights, particularly for marginalized communities who had long been neglected or dismissed by the medical system. She had started speaking at community events, sharing her story and the importance of self-advocacy in healthcare. Her message was clear: no one should ever feel powerless in the face of their own health. It wasn't long before Lydia's efforts caught the attention of local media outlets. Her story was featured in newspapers and on television, and she was invited to speak at national conferences on healthcare reform. She was a woman who had fought for her life, and in the process, she had become a beacon of hope for others. One afternoon, as Lydia sat in her office, preparing for another speaking engagement, Marcus walked in with a smile on his face. "Guess what?" he said, holding up a flyer. Lydia raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "They want you to speak at a national healthcare summit," Marcus said, his voice full of pride. "They've heard about your work, and they want you to be the keynote speaker." Lydia blinked, momentarily stunned. "What? Me? Of course you," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. "You've become the voice of so many people who don't have one. You're making real change happen." Lydia couldn't help but smile. It was a far cry from the terrified woman who had walked into Dr. Hawkins' office all those months ago. She had faced a life-threatening condition and survived. But more importantly, she had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. As Lydia prepared for her keynote speech, Dr. Hawkins received an unexpected invitation. It was from the same healthcare summit that Lydia had been asked to attend. The invitation was addressed to him personally, and the letter requested his presence to discuss his efforts in changing the culture of patient care. Hawkins stared at the letter for a moment, conflicted. He had never been one for public speaking or accolades. He had always preferred the quiet satisfaction of doing his job well. But now he realized that his story could inspire change on a much larger scale. He thought back to Lydia's words, the ones she had sent him months ago. Her forgiveness had been the catalyst for his own redemption, and now he had the opportunity to continue that work. It wasn't long before Hawkins found himself standing at the podium, looking out at a room full of healthcare professionals, policymakers, and advocates. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. "I stand before you today, not as a man who has achieved perfection, but as someone who has learned the hard way that compassion, humility, and patient-centered care are not optional. They are the foundation upon which healthcare must be built." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. For too long, many of us in the medical field have allowed our expertise to blind us to the most important aspect of healthcare: the people we serve. Hawkins continued. "We focused on diagnosis and treatment plans, but we've forgotten to listen. We've forgotten to look at our patients as individuals, not just cases." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "Lydia Carter is the reason I am here today," Hawkins said, his voice softening with emotion. "She taught me that medicine is not just about fixing bodies. It's about healing the soul, about acknowledging the humanity in every person we treat." The summit was a turning point for Hawkins, not just professionally, but personally. He received standing ovations for his speech, but more importantly, he received countless messages from colleagues, thanking him for his honesty and encouraging others to follow in his footsteps. But perhaps the most important change came in his relationship with Lydia. Months after the summit, Hawkins visited the community center where Lydia had given her first speech. She was there, as always, advocating for those who couldn't speak up for themselves. As he approached her, he was struck by the way she carried herself, strong, confident, and unapologetically herself. "You did it," Hawkins said quietly, his admiration palpable. Lydia smiled warmly. "We did it. You and me." She held out her hand, and without hesitation, Hawkins took it. It wasn't an apology or a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of their shared journey, a moment of mutual respect. Together, they had changed the course of their lives, and perhaps the lives of countless others. The legacy of their work wasn't just about the policies they helped shape or the speeches they gave. It was about the lives they touched, the patients who were now heard, and the healthcare professionals who had learned to listen. And as Dr. Hawkins and Lydia Carter stood side by side, they knew that their story had only just begun. The ripple effect they had started was still spreading, and it would continue to transform the way the world approached medicine. One patient, one doctor, and one act of compassion at a time. The full circle. Months had passed since Dr. Hawkins and Lydia Carter had given their groundbreaking speeches at the Healthcare Summit. The ripple effect of their words had grown beyond anything they had imagined, affecting not only those in attendance, but also communities far and wide. The reforms they had fought for began to take root, as hospitals across the country started implementing patient-centered practices that prioritized listening to the voices of the most vulnerable. Yet despite all the changes that had occurred, Hawkins still felt as though there was something more he needed to do. A final piece to the puzzle that would allow him to truly make amends for his past mistakes. It was late one evening when he received a call from an unexpected source. It was the director of a prominent nonprofit organization focused on racial health disparities. "Dr. Hawkins," the voice on the other end said, "we've been following your work, and we believe your story can make a difference. We would like to invite you to join a new initiative aimed at combating healthcare inequalities, particularly those faced by Black communities." The words hit Hawkins like a punch to the stomach. He had spent so much time reflecting on his role in the healthcare system, but he had never fully confronted the depths of the racism that still pervaded it. His mistakes with Lydia had been just one piece of a much larger problem, a problem he now had an opportunity to help address in a meaningful way. "I'm honored," Hawkins replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "But I'm afraid I'm still learning. I don't know if I'm the right person for this." The director, a woman named Rachel, paused for a moment before responding. "That's exactly why we want you to be involved. We need people who are willing to admit their mistakes and do the hard work to make things right. Your story shows that change is possible, and that's what we need." After a long conversation, Hawkins agreed to join the initiative, knowing that this was the next step in his journey. Lydia, too, had been making strides in her advocacy work. After the summit, she was offered a seat on the board of the nonprofit organization she had spoken about during her keynote address. She had become an influential voice in the fight for racial equity in healthcare, working with community leaders to ensure that Black patients received the care they deserved. One evening, as she was preparing a presentation for a local community meeting, she received a message from Hawkins. It was a simple text, but the words carried more weight than any phone call could have. "Lydia, I've been given an opportunity to join a new initiative focused on racial health disparities. I need your advice. Will you help me?" Lydia sat back in her chair, the message sinking in. She had always known that Hawkins had changed, but this was something more. This was him acknowledging the urgency of the very issues she had fought for since the beginning of her recovery. Her response was immediate. "Of course. I'll be there every step of the way. You're not in this alone." The initiative focused on addressing the systemic inequalities that plagued the healthcare system. It sought to break down barriers that prevented Black patients from receiving adequate care, including racial bias among healthcare professionals, lack of access to quality healthcare in underserved communities, and disparities in treatment options. Hawkins and Lydia became key figures in the movement, working tirelessly to raise awareness, educate healthcare providers, and push for legislative changes. Together, they traveled to rural communities, speaking with patients who had been denied the care they needed, hearing their stories of neglect and injustice. They listened to the pain and frustration that had been silenced for so long. Each visit left a lasting impact. In one community, Hawkins met a young woman named Tasha, whose mother had died from complications during childbirth. Despite her repeated requests for a cesarean section, the attending physician had dismissed her concerns, labeling her as overdramatic. Tasha's mother died in labor, and Tasha was left with the haunting knowledge that her mother's death could have been prevented if only someone had listened. After hearing her story, Hawkins made a promise to Tasha. "I will do everything I can to ensure that no one else experiences what your mother went through. Your voice matters, and I will make sure it is heard." It was moments like these that kept Hawkins going, moments where he knew that the work they were doing was changing lives. One evening, as Lydia and Hawkins were preparing for another presentation, they found themselves sitting together in the small office of the nonprofit organization. They had just returned from a particularly emotional meeting with a group of Black healthcare workers who had shared their own experiences of discrimination within the medical field. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of hope, the knowledge that change was possible if they kept fighting for it. Lydia looked at Hawkins, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked quietly. Hawkins nodded. "Every day. But I also think about how much more needs to be done. We can't stop now." "I know," Lydia said, her voice firm. "We've started something, but it's just the beginning. There's still so much to change, so much to fix." "I know," Hawkins agreed, his eyes filled with resolve. "And I'm going to keep fighting for it. For all the patients like Tasha, like the ones I let down. I'll never stop." Lydia smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'm glad you're with me on this. We're in this together." As the initiative gained momentum, Hawkins and Lydia found themselves at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping the healthcare system from the inside out. They spoke to lawmakers, advocating for policies that would address racial health disparities. They worked with medical schools to ensure that future doctors were trained to recognize and confront their own biases. They launched community outreach programs to educate Black patients on their rights and how to navigate the healthcare system. And through it all, their bond grew stronger. It wasn't just a shared mission that brought them together. It was the understanding that they had both faced immense challenges and had come out on the other side, stronger and more determined than ever before. Years later, Dr. Hawkins stood before a crowded auditorium, delivering a speech at the opening of a new medical center dedicated to serving underserved communities. The center was a direct result of the work he and Lydia had put in over the years, an effort that had touched thousands of lives. As he spoke, Hawkins couldn't help but think of Lydia, who was sitting in the front row, her eyes proud and filled with warmth. She had become more than a colleague to him. She had become a friend, a partner in a fight that was far from over. "We've made progress," Hawkins said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But the work is never done. Our mission is to ensure that every person, regardless of race, background, or socioeconomic status, receives the care they deserve. And we will continue to fight, for as long as it takes, to make that vision a reality." The crowd erupted into applause, but Hawkins' eyes were on Lydia. She gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that they had both played a part in something much larger than themselves. Together, they had fought for justice, for equity, and for a healthcare system that worked for everyone. And as they stood side by side, they knew that their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning.